Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing the album Bilateral by the band Leprous.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So for those of you who've been counting, you'd know that tomorrow I'm gonna come back from Germany. Wait, what do you mean? Yeah, I'm not here right now. I'm actually flying to Germany tomorrow, and only tomorrow when this episode will be released will I be coming back here. So yeah, it's an odd case, don't ask me about it. But anyway, hopefully I enjoyed my trip, because from now on, we're gonna have to do the last push until the end of the year. But anyway, that doesn't have anything to do with this album today, but here are some of my favorite bits from this album. So I'll open this review up by telling you all that today's album is a metal album, and more specifically a tech metal album made by the Norwegian band called Leprous. Now the reason I find it important to say is because these two things are things that I usually don't like about my music, and that's metal music and music that originates in Norway. And today's morning when I first listened to this album, I will be quite honest with you all, I really wasn't in the mood for a metal album, and I really thought about skipping this one and coming back to it later, but I decided to do what I always do on this list, and that's a pretty much unspoken rule. I never skip an album on the list. And the reason I never skip an album on the list and always listen to them in the correct order in which they're numbered is because, well, there's two reasons. You see, the first reason is because it will throw me off. There's an entirely thing about order when it comes to doing this series, and every single thing that I do has to be very orderly for me to stay focused on what I do. And the second reason is if I let myself skip any amount of albums or any specific albums on here, I will basically encourage myself to not want to listen to certain music. And well, I will assume that most of you can see the downsides and negatives of it. And another thing about it, I never really know what an album might sound like. And just judging it by its cover or name or lands of origin or subgenre of progressive rock definitely isn't a right thing to do, because most of the times I am very much surprised, and that goes both ways. There's sometimes metal albums which I immediately very much love, and a lot of times where I listen to symphonic prog albums which I immediately just hate. So it's best to look at all albums on the list as equals and listen to them in their order, because again, if I were to choose the albums I do on here, this list wouldn't have existed. So I hit the play button and I started listening to this, and immediately I realized that my fears were correct and that I was getting into something that I really didn't want to listen to. I listened to the first two tracks on this album and I realized to myself, oh my god, I got myself into not a progressive, very much stale metalcore album. But for anyone who wants to crucify me right now, don't leave the video. I swear it does actually get better. So definitely my first moments with this album start off on a left foot. But then the third track came on. That track is called Restless, and I suddenly started to realize that maybe there was more to this music. I wasn't really in love with that track or anything, and it wasn't that better from the first two, but it was definitely different. So I took myself and I told myself, you know what, maybe we started off on the wrong foot, but this might be an actual good thing. So I recuperated myself, I took a deep breath, and I came back into this album not on autopilot, not expecting it to be a bad album, and I'm really glad that I did so. I wouldn't really say that I enjoyed this album too much, but it's definitely not a bad album. It's not one that I thought to myself that I was suffering to listen to or that I really didn't enjoy it. It's definitely one that got more interesting as it progressed and there was more to dwell into. And my half-assed reasoning for why this album starts off so non-progressively, so disinteresting, so basic metal, and then continues on to be more interesting is maybe because the band sort of had to let off some steam, as they say, and start off with a really strong piece of music that it's just what they wanted to do. Maybe it's more reminiscent of their last album, which I specifically don't know, so they wanted to get the fans into something they are better acquainted with or something like that. But it seemed like after the two first songs were over, this album got a whole lot more interesting, despite still not being my definite cup of prog. I do think that these guys went in the right direction and started changing the moods of this album, sometimes being very rough, sometimes being very calm, and introducing some very eclectic ideas into the music as well. They weren't going at it very much religiously, I would say. They still remained a lot in their roots, but there was definitely something to be said about this album in the way that it included various different genres and inspirations. I know that this isn't chronological, but I actually already listened to the album Colors by Between the Buried and Me, and that's an extreme metal album which definitely includes a lot of eclectic ideas into it, and I think that from then on I just kind of started comparing each and every album to that album. So listening to Bilateral by Leprous, I kind of just compared it to that album by Between the Buried and Me and seeing how eclectic it is. I don't know if that's a right thing to do, but I do think that these guys were definitely showing some effort. And I think that the prime example of what I did actually like from this album comes in the form of the fifth track called MB Indifferentia. This one was definitely a rule breaker. It didn't feel like a metal song, and that's something that I very much enjoyed, and I know it's not right to enjoy a non-metal song within a metal album in a metal band, but that's just me, and that's my favorite from this album. I will have to admit that going along with this album, I still kind of wasn't in the mood for listening to it, so while I could at least somewhat appreciate the music on here, I found myself very much disinterested in it by the end. And you know what, there are some times like that. Maybe in another day I'd like this album more, but in all honesty, it wasn't one that I particularly enjoyed. But if I will have to add something before I finish this review off, is telling you all that I actually didn't even suffer listening to this album. There was no particular bad song on here. I wouldn't even say that there were many mediocre albums which I was completely indifferent towards. Most of them were good, not anything special, but definitely a fun listen for anyone who does like this kind of music, but for me, this is definitely not my cup of prog. So this cover, it's a neat cover, and I even think that it's featured on the intro for the series. I actually do like the pretty much surreal imagery to be found on this one. It's pretty much dark and somewhat disturbing in a very odd way, but I kind of just like it. I think that the execution is nice, the painting is really lovely, and the colors being used on here are very subtle in the way that they are emphasized. I do not know what this cover has to do with the meaning of this album, the meaning of its songs, how does it connect to all of that, but honestly I don't really care. It's a pretty cool cover. But if there's one thing though, is the fact that there's the band logo and the album name, and they are located in this gray circle that's just stamped on the cover in a very unflattering way. Honestly, they should have just left it as the painting is. They shouldn't have put the band logo on there, and if they should have, at least not in this way. It disrupts the symmetry and the beautifulness of this painting in order to put something that is honestly just kind of pretty much disgusting. I don't like this gray circle of doom. It doesn't look good, and I think that it takes whatever is really good looking from this album and just kind of downgrades it all to a point which really isn't that appealing to look at anymore. So I'm sorry if this video felt a bit rushed. I usually do these videos when I have plenty of time to do them, but for now I really have to finish this one right now because, as I said, I am flying tomorrow and this is the last video that I will have made basically in advance for this trip, so the schedule for this series wouldn't be disrupted. But yeah, I need to give you the rating. So the rating for this one is actually a pretty much fair, I think, 6 out of 10. Again, not my my cup of prog, but definitely not a bad album. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to Above Cirrus by Pure Reason Revolution. Now, the funny thing about this one is that I'm actually going to be listening to it, I think, on the flight, or maybe when I even wait in the terminal tomorrow. And the reasoning for it is because I'm going to be seeing Pure Reason Revolution performing live in the festival I'm going to, and they're probably going to be performing this album because this album came out this year and it's their newest release. So I'm really happy for that, and hopefully I'll get to tell you all about it. And you know where I'll tell you all about it? On my Patreon, because I'm gonna make these crude vlogs every single day, hopefully, and we'll be able to see that if you support me over on Patreon. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon already, which are Clay Wallum and Wrist of Kings. You are the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon and see these vlogs, well, you can do that right now from the link in the description or in my about page. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all after I come back from Germany. Bye, guys.